Great. Okay. So this week I'm going over the portion Chayei Sara. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right, so sorry about my Hebrew. And it covers Genesis chapter 23, verse 1 through Genesis chapter 25, verse 18. So in this portion, some of the main events is the death of Sarah. Abraham sends his servant to go find a wife for Isaac, who ends up being Rebecca. And we see that Abraham marries again to Keturah and has some children with her. So do those things kind of sound familiar to people? Nope, none of you have read this part before. All new, never heard of Isaac.
That's correct.
Okay, so if you can recall this portion of the Torah, what are some of the things that stand out to you? Okay, so I guess we don't have much input. That's fine. I have lots to say this week, or I have lots of questions to.
Lee,
Yes?
will you tell me what the portion is? I'm sorry. I heard you describe it, but will you tell me what the actual...
Like the verses?
Yeah.
Genesis 23:1 through 25:18.
Okay, thank you.
Yep. Okay, so I'm just
Hey,
gonna...
would it be possible to read it, since I'm probably neglectful in my homework assignments, I'm guessing?
That's a whole lot to read. That's like at least 2 chapters.
Oh, okay.
Well, we can read a portion of the portion.
We could read a portion of the portion. Hold a moment. Let me bring that up. I should have done that. That's okay.
Did you say start at 23:1 with 23:1? Okay.
So I will read, if everyone's okay with that. Actually, I'll just read all of 23. It's a little bit... Let me see now. Hold a second.
We can help.
I'm trying to figure out how much I want to read. Yeah, let's do all of 23. I'll go and do it. Unless David, do you want to read chapter 23? David Kissinger.
Well, I know Tally probably already has it pulled up.
I do.
If you would like to read chapter 23, I would
Want me
appreciate
to
it.
start? I'll start. How about that? And then somebody can take over when I'm too exhausted to continue.
Yep.
Okay. The burial of Sarah. When Sarah was 127 years old, she died at Kiriath Arba, now called Hebron, in the land of Canaan. There Abraham mourned and wept for her. Then, leaving her body, he said to the Hittite elders, "Here I am, a stranger and a foreigner among you. Please sell me a piece of land so I can give my wife a proper burial." The Hittites replied to Abraham, "Listen, my lord, you are an honored prince among us. Choose the finest of our tombs and bury her there. No one here will refuse to help you in this way." Then Abraham bowed low before the Hittites and said, "Since you are willing to help me in this way, be so kind as to ask Ephron, son of Zohar, to let me buy his cave at Machpelah, down at the end of his field. I will pay the full price in the presence of witnesses, so I will have a permanent burial place for my family." Ephron was sitting there among the others, and he answered Abraham as the others listened, speaking publicly before the Hittite elders of the town. "No, my lord," he said to Abraham, "please listen to me. I will give you the field and the cave. Here in the presence of my people, I give it to you. Go and bury your dead." Abraham again bowed low before the citizens of the land, and he replied to Ephron as everyone listened, "No, listen to me. I will buy it from you. Let me pay the full price for the field so I can bury my dead there." Ephron answered Abraham, "My lord, please listen to me. The land is worth 400 pieces of silver. But what is that between friends? Go ahead and bury your dead." So Abraham agreed to Ephron's price and paid the amount he had suggested, 400 pieces of silver, weighed according to the market standard. The Hittite elders witnessed the transaction. Does anybody want to start? Oh, hey, I'm almost done. So Abraham bought the plot of land belonging to Ephron at Machpelah near Mamre. This included the field itself, the cave that was in it, and all the surrounding trees. It was transferred to Abraham as his permanent possession in the presence of the Hittite elders at the city gate. Then Abraham buried his wife Sarah there in Canaan, in the cave at Machpelah near Mamre, also called Hebron. So the field and the cave were transferred from the Hittites to Abraham for use as a permanent burial place.
Thank you, Tally. Okay. So can someone refresh us what happened right before this? Like what happened in last week's portion?
Well, we didn't talk much about it, but the end of last week's portion, or almost the end, was Abraham being asked to sacrifice Isaac.
Yep. Okay. So knowing that that's where we ended this week, and now we're talking about the death of Sarah, what are some questions and thoughts you all have about these two chapters?
Well, I brought it up last week, but it strikes me that after the incident with the non-sacrifice of Isaac, Abraham and Sarah seem to kind of separate. You don't hear Sarah again, and then in my translation it says basically that Abraham came back to mourn Sarah after going down to Bathsheba, and so that was just an oddity that I remember from reading this part of the portion, is that Abraham kind of leaves and actually goes to where Hagar lives, and then returns in this chapter to mourn Sarah after she's dying. I also think it's interesting in this chapter that we just read, it really reminds me of a real estate closing because they keep restating the same thing over and over again. And so I think part of this was, it's clear that Abraham does not want this land as a gift. He does not want to be dependent. He does not want it to be taken back. And so he keeps insisting that it actually be sold to him. And so even in the offhand way that Ephron kind of says, well, I'll give it to you. It's worth this much, but I'll give it to you. And Abraham's like, thank you for finally telling me what your price is. Here's the money. And then they restate maybe 2 or 3 other times. And so this was the land, and these are the boundaries, and this is all that was included in the sale price. So it just really reminds me of sitting in the, I forget what office it is, the title company office, and signing 800 papers if you buy a house, that they all say the same thing, and they all keep restating exactly how much you're paying for exactly what. And so this is like the title office chapter of Genesis 23. So I almost expected, Ephraim to give him a potted plant at the end to symbolize, hey, you're a new homeowner.
It made me think of how Don said, the Jewish tradition would be, if you're going to purchase something from somebody, you would offer them, the best price. And the person, to try to do right by you, would say, well, I'm not going to charge you that much. I want to, I want to make sure I'm not taking advantage of you. And I really thought this could go on forever. Like it just goes back and forth and back and forth, and it's making me laugh. But I didn't think of it like a real estate transaction, but you're exactly right. That is what it was like.
It's Chip and Dale buy a field.
Right.
I thought that was really funny. And
then Wade, that he was like, okay, look, I'm giving you this gift. It's worth $400, but I'm going to give it to you. But the price, if you were to purchase it, would be $400.
And I won't take a penny more, but I'm giving it to you.
Right. It's so funny.
So Wade, you talked about how at the end of chapter 22, it talks that Abraham goes to Beersheba, and then we see this chapter open sometime later. We got that Sarah has died at Hebron. So as a general audience question, how much time do you think elapsed between those two events?
Well, the travel time alone obviously probably was many weeks. Then there was obviously, I'm guessing, Abraham spent time with his concubine, and that would take at least a day or two. Why are you laughing, Tally? That's what happens when you have a concubine. It's not?
I don't know. I've never had a concubine.
My point is, it would be, I would estimate at minimum. Also, if he moved all of his family and the herd, I mean, that could easily been, several months. And also the herd would have to eat, and you'd have to find new lodging, a safe location to become inhabited at. And then the people in that area, it seemed like, knew him. So I would easily say it could have been more than a year, or much more than a year.
Sarah was 90 when she had Isaac? Is that right?
I've been thinking that since I started this, and I was like, I don't know what Sarah's ages are at most of these.
I mean, I know she was old. I want to say 90, and I was just glancing, couldn't find it for sure. But you could take 90 plus whatever you think Isaac was, which that's debatable too, though, right? When Isaac was sacrificed, if he was a boy or more of a teen. So at least you got that. But even with her being 90 to 127, that's not that many years. Like in theory, depending how old you think Isaac was and how exactly old she was, she might have died pretty soon afterwards. 90 is the new 70.
That is for making different dishes for food.
Okay, so I'm really thankful for Sarah's comments. Also, Sarah, are you and Meadow matching today?
Why, yes, we are.
Okay, just wanted to double check.
My sister in New York has two girls, and she had gotten these for a family photo a while back, and her girls are different ages, but it works out. So Abby has a matching one too.
That's so cute. So I'm thankful for Sarah's comment, because one of the commentaries I read suggested that Sarah died because she thought Isaac went to go sacrifice her son. Because Abraham went to go sacrifice her son, Isaac. And she hears this news, and in the commentary, I think the Midrash said it was Satan who came and told her, hey, Abraham sacrificed your kid that you waited so long to have and struggled so long to have that God promised you. Have a nice day. And she kind of died from the shock and the pain of losing her only son. And I thought that was really interesting because the title of the article that talks about this is Where Was Sarah? So looking back at chapter 21, which I realized was last week, you see the Treaty of Beersheba at the end of 21. 22 is the sacrifice of Isaac, and at the end of that talks about Abraham going back to Beersheba, where the story would last, I guess, left off. And then we go to 23 at Hebron, where Sarah is. So it just brings up an interesting question, and where was Sarah during Abraham's decisions to, or Abraham's call to go sacrifice Isaac and his decision to go do that? So what are your thoughts about where Sarah was and Sarah's thoughts and reactions to Abraham's call and response?
Is there any possibility that Abraham went with Hagar and Ishmael and left, and that was when he left? I mean, we see that he got up and he put him on Hagar's shoulder and sent her away, so maybe not. But the next thing has Abraham working with Abimelech in Beersheba.
I think that's a good question. What do you all think about that?
Well, that goes to what I was talking about last week, that there seems to be kind of two traditions that are kind of melded or competing in the text. One of which is that basically you could say it's the Isaac and the Ishmael traditions. You know, both seem to be present, you know, and so, you know, so sometimes Abraham is seen as being with Sarah, and other times he's seen as being with Hagar. And like, to me, it almost feels like in the text, there's when it was going from an oral to a written tradition, that they're trying to find ways to include or reconcile both traditions in the text. And so, you know, so things like which wife is, or concubine is Abraham with at what time, what son is being talked about when they say firstborn son, you know, and so like in the Muslim tradition, it's Ishmael that is sacrificed, or that he's asked to sacrifice, not Isaac. You know, and so kind of other evidence of two traditions that are present. And so, and I realize that I take a very textual view of the text, and that it's being put together by human editors. And so, so to me, asking like, you know, what do I think happened? You know, like who was he with? Was he with Sarah? Was he with Hagar? I think we can't know, because the editors have either knowingly or unknowingly kind of obfuscated that part, either because they didn't know how to put those two traditions together, or because it was a compromise between both traditions, which were felt to be true.
Yeah, and I think that that's like a natural human thing. Like whenever we try to tell stories or family stories or remember back, like at least in my life, I think back to something, I'll be like, oh yeah, that was like when this happened. And then like, no, wait, maybe that was the other time I was in that city, or like, and it takes me a while. And I think that, you know, I don't know exactly what I'm trying to say, but like if these things, if you can hold the text somewhat loosely because of that, it gives you that freedom to play without like being upset that maybe the text is inconsistent. And how can the text be inconsistent if it's inspired by God and then it becomes a faith crisis? But if like we fully acknowledge the human contribution to the text and humanness in memory and writing things, I don't know, it gives that permission to have those things happen.
Right, without invalidating the whole thing as untrue, or or introducing, well, there was purposeful, like, editorial deceit, going on, like that something was trying to be hidden, but rather just that there were multiple competing narratives that are a product of the humanness of the tradition.
If I have to leave suddenly, Meadow's getting a little loopy. It's not anybody here. Don't take it personal.
So you all I think you make all very good contributions and points about the story and the inconsistency and what it's trying to do. So I want to go back to my my prior question. So where do you think Sarah was during Abraham's journey up the mountain with Isaac?
And Craig points out that the sacrifice of the
Right, sorry, I froze. Did anyone else freeze?
Yeah, everything was frozen for me and it completely logged out and then came back on.
Okay, I'm glad I'm not the only one. Makes me feel more acceptable.
Yeah. I don't understand how the wind affects the internet. Someone can explain that to me another time.
Yeah, it's like it blows the Wi-Fi waves all out of, sync, and they just all get tangled up into a blob of tangled waves. You don't believe me.
That doesn't sound very scientific.
I'm guessing there was a brief power outage at Buckeye that like the generators kicked in or whatever.
That makes a lot more sense.
Actually, Kathy, according to the Talmud, Wi-Fi and wind are like these opposing forces, and if you look into one midrash,
it's the pneuma and the anti-pneuma are competing.
Got it.
And actually, spirit is the same as Wi-Fi.
Oh. Well, now it all comes together.
Now we're buying the bullshit.
So to Lee's question, I guess it all depends on what happens between 22 verse 2 and verse 3, which in 22, 1 and 2, Abraham is told, take your son, your only son Isaac, and go to Moriah, sacrifice him there as a burnt offering. And then it says, early the next morning, Abraham saddled his donkey and he took his 2 servants. And so I guess the question is, what does Sarah know and when does she know it? Has Abraham confided this with her? And have they, what have they talked about? Or did he realize that, there's no way that Sarah is going to, after all of this struggle, it's amazing enough that Abraham has to go through this trial, but to have both of them go through and both of them agree on the same outcome, so, there's nothing in the text that says that Sarah knew before they left what the intention was, much less the outcome. But I guess that's what happens when you have texts that that favor or put at the forefront the male point of view, rather than giving you multiple points of view from the non-patriarch characters.
I have a question that has nothing to do with Lee's question. And I guess I'm kind of wondering, this is the same Abraham that like argued God down to 10 people for Sodom and Gomorrah, but didn't bother to argue with God over his own son's life. So what the heck's up with that?
I think that would have seemed self-serving, as opposed to saving the Sodom and Gomorrah was a gregarious or an act of grace that he was asking for from God, as opposed to a personal request he was asking for related to his son.
I mean, Sodom and Gomorrah, he was essentially also arguing for his nephew, because of, I get the impression that the reason that he cares about the people of Sodom and Gomorrah is because he knows that his family, in the form of Lot, is living there. And probably the reason that he thinks he can argue down to 10 is that between Lot and his wife and his daughters and their associates, there might be 10.
Yeah, I agree that there's obviously a familial connection. I just think it's not as tight as asking for your own son's life.
Well, I really like Amanda's question, and as fitting, I think, would be for Des. I always like when my questions are answered with questions, right? And just something I've been thinking about reading over, some commentaries and whatnot about that, like, we talk about this as a test of Abraham, and mostly as was he willing to sacrifice his son, but was it also, part of me is like, was it also meant to be a test of Sarah? Like, they are part of a couple, or was part of the test for Abraham to see how he would engage Sarah about this issue. Like, is this test multifaceted and not just about Isaac and sacrificing his only son?
Especially because, Isaac isn't his only son, it is her only son.
Right. Yeah, I guess I always, from my experience in churches that didn't spend a lot of time questioning, why the patriarchal view. Because of that, I just, in my mind, imagined Sarah just letting him go off at home, wringing her hands over the decision that he made without her. Just like, he said God told him to do it, so who am I to argue with him about it? So that she would just be, home fretting, washing dishes or something, which I think, because I thought that if something different had happened, that we would be told. But who even knows? I don't know that I necessarily think that. It's just I didn't ever question it before today.
So in the article I read, which I'll post in the chat, in the last paragraph, it talks about, throughout the article, it talks about them blowing the shofar as reminders of Sarah's cry, and the idea that it's meant to, if Sarah did die, like, from losing her son or thinking she lost him, like, this is meant to, like, remind God that sometimes the test he gives, onto his, sometimes they leave marks on the innocent, right? So this trial, if this was meant to be a trial of Abraham, and if Sarah's death had something to do with that sacrifice, like, which, the testing, God's testing of Abraham marked Sarah so deeply that she died. An idea like, so what do we think of this idea that God testing us can leave marks on people unaffected, or like have collateral damage and leave marks on the innocent?
Well, I think even if we don't read it as Sarah dying of grief because she thinks mistakenly that Isaac was sacrificed, I can certainly read it as Sarah, that Abraham leaves Sarah because he can't bear that, that he was willing to do that, whereas she might not have, so that this caused a rift between her and Abraham that was not repaired before her death, that he left to Beersheba and only returned after she died. That basically that him making that decision on their behalf, that this test, no matter what he did, that he was willing to do that, was the end of their relationship. And then I think, how can Isaac have a relationship with his father? Like how permanently altered that should have been, given the circumstance that, and how was that relationship repaired if it was? So I definitely agree that, that these things, even if they quote unquote all work out, in the end, the very act of testing can permanently alter your relationships with others.
I have two thoughts. The first one is specifically related to the text, and the second one is not so much. So the first one is, now when I'm thinking about, after this discussion that we've had so far, thinking about him haggling, or not haggling, but it puts a whole different emphasis on the fact that Abraham wanted to assign the value to the land where he was going to bury her. It sort of makes me feel like that possibly there was some guilt involved, that he said, no, I'm going to pay top dollar, and he didn't say that, but, I'm going to pay the money for this land because I owe it to her, kind of, that he came back after, having not repaired a relationship, and said, and is trying to give her, honor, and yeah, does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
In death, possibly because of, guilty feelings, or having never have worked it out. What else can he give to her now? And then personally, I think I actually have very, very negative feelings towards people who, so we're told in this story, that God has given this challenge to Abraham, but in our lives, most of the time, I think people who believe, this thing that's happening is God testing me, they don't know if that's the case for sure. They may be tested by their circumstances, but they don't know if God has caused that purposefully to test them. Does that make sense? Versus everything coming together, other people's decisions, whatever it is that cause you to be tested. Bad things happen, and it's not always because God's testing you, right? And I just think there's a very self-centered belief that something that's happening that not only affects you, but those around you, that it's because God's testing you. God's testing you, and now all these people are in pain. But it's just really important that I learn this lesson. So the people connected to me are all going through something very painful because of it, but it's about me. Like, I really have a hard time with that. And I think the main reason I have a hard time with it is because it takes such a view that is just so self-centered that often, because I'm saying all these people around me are in pain, but that's not what the person says. They only talk about themselves and how God is testing them. It's like they don't even stop to think like, oh, maybe this isn't about me. I don't know. I have a really hard time with that. And then the second half of that is also, I feel like, how dare you presume to know what God is thinking? Like, how dare you? Like, it could be any number of circumstances that cause this negative thing to happen that sure you can learn from, but you're putting it on God. I don't know. I just have a really hard time with that. Yes, Wade?
So, two things. One, I used to keep this list of kind of theological quandaries that I had that for historical reasons were called Chicago questions. But anyway, one of them was, what's the difference between God's testing and Satan's tempting? Because often to me, it seemed in the church that if you passed it, it was God testing you. But if you failed it, it was Satan tempting you. And you couldn't know until afterwards what the situation was, because it didn't follow the laws of cause and effect. It was the effect determined who caused it, And so this idea, I think that relates to your idea of kind of the self-centeredness of God's testing,
Right.
that if you feel like it's something that you individually were able to withstand, then it was clearly a test and you passed.
Right.
But if you're going through something and it feels like the something is winning, clearly that was the work of the devil,
Right.
Which you can't be blamed for not being able to withstand that, And so, anyway, I feel like that relates. But then the other thing that I was thinking, both from what you were saying about the self-centeredness and also before, was, what if we apply that lens that we apply here at Dust a Lot and say, what if this isn't about the individual? What if this is about the community? What if this is about God's relationship with not Abraham or Isaac, but about God's covenant to a whole community? And now this is the beginning of that community, so it's still a very small community.
Right.
And so then even when I read these things that are putting the names of individuals in it, then I have to say, well, what happens between verse 2 and 3? What happens in this community of Abraham and Sarah and Isaac and frankly Ishmael and Hagar too?
Right.
What happens with God's covenant community here, as opposed to just what is the individual decision of Abraham?
Yeah.
And what does that say about these kind of collateral damage effects? If you're making a decision based on a community and how that's going to affect the community versus a decision based upon one person's, thinking or response to a test or.
Right.
That's a lot of deep questions.
Mm-hmm.
I almost feel like I want you to write them down so I can think about them more after this. So does anyone else have any thoughts they want to contribute? Okay. Sorry, still thinking about Tally and Wade's remarks. Like, very, I guess I find them very impactful. Like, how do we know, and what does this say about like community, and where is that, like, does community still matter? And I don't know. And I guess part of my thoughts in response to you, Tally, about like, oh, is this God or is this Satan? Like, is a comment Don has made about how the church interprets the Bible. Like, this event with God testing Abraham, or even the idea that God tested Abraham multiple times. Like, Abraham is a very unique figure, right? It's, almost one of a kind. Like, the only, and then I think the idea that, and hearing what you have said, the idea that God tests us, it's like, well, none of us even come close to Abraham's, level. Like, we take something that's extraordinary and unique in the Bible and have made it ubiquitous, where God tests us all regularly. But even if you were to say God tests other people, like, who's the one that goes into the belly of the whale? Jonah. Like, even if he was to have tested Jonah, like, those are still two extraordinarily unique and extraordinary stories, which is why they're so particular, and why they're, in my mind, part of why they're in the Bible, because they're so unique and such unique individuals. Sorry, still thinking a little bit out loud, but okay. So this has gone. My notes did not prepare for you asking questions such as that.
So you're saying the Bible might suffer from publication bias, that we only hear about the non-unique, like the really unique individuals, and therefore we then extrapolate that, like, all of the negative results are not published. So, like, we don't see all the people that God doesn't test.
In a way, yes. Yep. I do think that, I mean, these people are held up, well, Abraham at least is held up as a model and a paradigm, and like, and yeah, it's like, if that happened to everyone, would Abraham be that special and have such a position as he does in the lore and canon of Judaism? So I guess that's part of it. So yeah, that might be a bias on my part, but I think, yeah, Craig points at what, like, but Craig gets to the heart of the matter. Like, why are some things personal to the subject or the text, but other things meant as something universal for readers? And how do we determine it? And anyway, so it's 11:30. This almost took more than I expected.
And you started out feeling like, oh, so nobody's got anything.
Yes, and then you and Wade just kind of took this to the next level. So we see right. So we see Abraham. Sarah dies. We go see Abraham come back, and to kind of summarize it, we then see. And so we see that after Sarah dies, Abraham, gets a wife for Isaac, sometime after, we aren't sure when. And we see after Isaac has been married, then we see that Abraham gets remarried. And one, there's kind of a Jewish tradition about, or in this, they pull out a midrash or a lesson from the Talmud, being that, like, if you will become widowed, you should make sure your adult children are provided for by having spouses before you get remarried, which I thought was kind of interesting and random. And then part of what one of the commentaries I mentioned said that Isaac, posits that Isaac was the matchmaker between Abraham and Keturah, and that also Keturah is just a different name for Hagar. So after Sarah passes, Abraham ends up marrying Hagar, so and that there's some of Isaac's influence in that. Because I think it was David Kissinger who had said back, like when we're talking about Beersheba, that did Abraham end up leaving Sarah for Hagar? But to ask a broader question, this idea of Abraham marrying his son off before he gets remarried, and Isaac having an influence in Abraham's marriage to Hagar, who's possible Hagar. And something I've been thinking about with this passage also, like with Abraham burying Sarah, and we're wondering, where was Isaac during the burial of Sarah? Like, what does it mean to honor our parents? What does it mean to honor our parents when they die? And what does it mean to honor our parents when they have been widowed, or when they have not had a good relationship with our other parents? And like, what does it mean for Isaac to honor his father when his father tried to sacrifice him?
Yeah, I think that is interesting that we're explicitly told that both Ishmael and Isaac bury Abraham. That they turn him to Hebron to bury him with Sarah, but that both of them are there, whereas both of them are seemingly absent at Sarah's burial, which makes sense for Ishmael, but not for Isaac, and like you said, it's back to what sort of damage to Sarah's relationship with her husband and their son was brought about, that her husband has to return to bury her, and that her son doesn't even do that when he will return to bury his father.
I guess now I'm very cynical about, was he there and it's just not mentioned? We don't know what Sarah was doing when he was, when Abraham was taking him up to sacrifice him. So maybe he was there and it's just not there. Somebody doesn't find it important. I don't know.
Right, that Abraham is important because someone has to buy the field. So.
I mean, seems like most of it's from his perspective and in those areas, because we don't get Sarah's perspective. So I don't know. We might not have Isaac's.
Do we know who wrote this part of Genesis?
I don't think we know who wrote Genesis a lot of the time, or at all. Unlike the New Testament, there's more clues in the New Testament about writers. Am I correct?
I mean, traditionally, all of the Torah is ascribed to Moses. So Moses wrote this part of Genesis. But,
there we go.
But then the textual theory says that most of this tradition was written down while they were in Babylonian exile. And so then you would say, well, which priests and scribes in Babylonian exile were the ones that, wrote this? And then there's all sorts of theories based on, which names of God are used in different sections to try to ascribe certain sections to certain camps of those, So, but, the best guess is it's written by Babylonian Jews.
Coming from an oral tradition. I mean, it's
right.
just basically, it was an oral tradition, and then whether they left something out or not, that's really
Right.
what that scribe, what their role would have been, leaving something out.
But let's just say it was probably not the women of Israel in exile that were writing the Torah down and taking their oral traditions and making them the written tradition. So.
I can't tell if Lee's crying or laughing.
It looks like she tasted something that was very pungent.
Jalapeno cranberry sauce.
Oh, wow. Happy holidays.
It's good. A little spicy. Flavor combination, but I would recommend it.
Good.
I'm just dying a little bit. I'm half dead. Okay, it's about 11:40, so I'll guess we'll wrap this up. So, yeah, I just wanted to throw out that question because what does it mean to honor your parents is something I'm always asking myself, and yeah, and part of me, and I've really enjoyed today. I've enjoyed the questions you have all asked and the way you have made me think, because part of me is like, well, first it's like, well, where was Sarah during, Isaac's sacrifice? And then where's Isaac during Sarah's death? And does Isaac, is he mad at Sarah that she wasn't there to protect him or something? And it's just like, dang, this could be some, seems like the family dynamics are much more than I ever questioned or considered. And I guess the idea of honoring your parents has been something I've been thinking about a lot for the past few months, because as most of you know, my grandma was very sick. I was going to go down to Florida to help care for her, and she ended up passing away. I guess she wasn't really sick. She was just fading, I don't know, however you want to talk about what old people do. She was bedridden, but mostly healthy. Anyway, the idea was going down, and for me, a lot of it was like a way of honoring my family and honoring my parents and my parents' parents. And everyone's like, "Oh, it must be so hard to lose a loved one, and grandparents are so special." And I wasn't close to my Nana. Maybe saw her as a kid once every few years. But the idea was doing it to honor her because I could, and it's made me think, how do I interact with my own parents, and what does it mean to honor them? And something I've already thought about, but it just seemed a very applicable question to this portion. How there seems to be a lot of family relationships in this that we don't, that the Bible is not explicit about, and that we don't often consider and ask questions. So anyway, just want to thank you all for your participation and for helping me with some of my thoughts. So before we move on, is there any last thoughts from you all? Any last thoughts or questions? Okay.
I was just going to say really quick.
Sorry, Amanda?
Sorry. I know I came in late, but I really appreciate a lot of the stuff that was thrown around today. So I know that certain people put in hard work when they prepare. So hopefully I'll learn from that example someday. So.
Okay, so lost my train of thought. Okay, so again, I think I say this most weeks, and it's almost always true. I can't think of a time where it's not. If you think of, if you all need some time to think about this and want to talk about it later, I am here. These are, I I really enjoy teaching and I enjoy studying because a lot kitty because like often these topics are things like where like I just love the questions. I love the questions and thoughts that you all think of and how when I ask more questions like it seems more relevant to me. So anyway, if you ever want to talk more, I would enjoy that most likely. Probably more than that cat's enjoying being held at least. Okay. Thank you, David. Okay, so I guess we'll end the recording and move on to prayer requests.